But anyway, it is a vestige of a Laurie King, Sherlock Holmes, Mary Russell event when some of you might have been here for that when we had a whole costume thing for them and they made the hat. So I thought, which is why I'm sort of wearing Edwardian. And for those of you who know who Anne Perry is, when she died, her executor sent me her earrings. So I am wearing Anne's Victorian earrings, that kind of match, which I think is really nice. Anyway, so what we're going to do is, because we have 3 different periods and 3 authors, actually 4, but 2 of them right together, we're going to talk to them sequentially, medieval, Regency, and Edwardian. And then we're going to take a little break, and we have shortbread, sort of a theme, and whatever, so you can move around, because you know your butts get really tired of these seats if you're in them more than an hour. And then we'll reconvene for a general little discussion and book signing. And I have a whole stack of things to give away. Some of which are new and some of which are older, but they're all historical fiction. And if you've read it already, you can give it to somebody else. But I'm going to give it as for the people who ask questions as an incentive, right? It's going to be like school. So anybody have any questions about what we're up to? We are also going to stream. We are streaming it. So if you miss anything, or if you know somebody who wishes they were here, you can direct them to the streaming when we're done. So anybody have any questions? It's been a while since we've done a group thing. I think it's kind of fun. All right, and you've seen, those of you who see our publicity, that we have live events all the way through this week until next Saturday, with the exception of Lisa Unger, who is a virtual event on Friday. So it's a really nifty week, and then it kind of calms down. And then from November 9th right to Thanksgiving, it's a live event every single day. I know. And I can't, I know that you're all wondering why. And the answer is I can't control it. This is what publishers do. They decide when they can send authors around and when we can fit them in and so forth. And, it's exhausting for us too. I always feel kind of guilty when we do that, because I know you can't actually live here, although you might want to put, a sleeping bag down on the floor. And occasionally I have thought that if we had room, we should do a B&B upstairs. Well, seriously, it would be a really good idea. But anyway, we don't have any control over how frequently authors come together, and I'm sorry about that, because it would be better if we did. So I told them to come over at 5 after. Randy, you want to go get them? They're probably having such a good time visiting that they don't want to actually come and talk, right? So we have a brother and sister, Beth and Boyd Morrison, who are our first authors, this being the book. And I accidentally ordered the first book, called The Lawless Land, in hardcover instead of paperback. So there are only the 2 books in the series, so I've discounted the hardcover down to the paperback price of $19, I think it is. Paperbacks have gotten really expensive. But anyway, if you're interested, you could buy them both, or just buy the first one if that appeals to you more. But that's the way it is. So here comes everybody. Pat, I think we're ready to go. Right there. I'm putting, no, not, Francine, I'm just going to do them at the beginning. So you and Boyd are over there. Right. You don't want to make faces from the audience? No, all right. Sounds great. Let me get rid of the hat. There we go.
Hello.
Sorry, Pat, did you say we were live? We are live. Well, in that case, good afternoon, virtual audience. Good afternoon, all of you who've been kind enough to come out on a Saturday and join us. I'm sad about the Diamondbacks not winning the 3rd game. I was really hoping they would go to Philadelphia 1 game up, but so it is. But anyway, for you're not a football fan, you're here, right? So I'd like to introduce you to, you can guess which one is Beth and which one is Boyd. And they are brother and sister. And some of you may know Boyd because he was here for several books that he co-wrote with Clive Cussler in the Oregon Files series. And then he also wrote thrillers of his own. And Beth has such an interesting resume. Maybe, Beth, you should just tell everybody what you do, because I'll probably blow it if I try.
Wonderful. Well, I'm hoping this mic is working. So people, perfect. Lovely. So I'm Beth Morrison, and I have my PhD in medieval art history, and I am senior curator of manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I'm just about to celebrate my 28th anniversary at the Getty. As I always say, the child labor laws were a lot more lenient back when I started, and it is absolutely the best job in the world. I get to go around to Europe and buy manuscripts and write other kinds of books, nonfiction books. But I have to say that writing with Boyd has been an amazing experience. And it's so much more fun than writing nonfiction books, because if I don't find it out, I just get to make it up.
So how do you feel about that?
Oh, I always love making stuff up. It's much easier but we do actually a lot of research for our books, because Beth is my ringer for getting all of the historical elements right, because I would never have written a book that takes place in 1351 in Europe, right after the Black Death and during the 100 Years' War, if I didn't have Beth with me, because I didn't know much about it at all, and I'm still learning a lot. And so whenever we have an issue about what's happening in history, or even simple things like where did they sleep when they're traveling, and what kind of food are they eating, and what kind of clothes do they wear, I didn't know. I'm much better at figuring out how to kill people.
Yeah. So we make a good team.
Well, you guys do make a good team. And Boyd talked to me for a long time about this project while he was still writing for Clive. And so I kind of wondered how it was all it seemed like an odd transition. But as it turns out, basically what we have is a sort of swashbuckling, scholarly medieval book, which is really a lot of fun. And in the first one, The Lawless Land, which I don't have up here, but we have plenty of copies of it. One of the joys of it is that we got to go to Mont Saint-Michel, which is a wonderful place. And so the geography, I think, in your books is really well done. This one, we're in Italy, but let's go back and talk for the benefit of those who haven't seen or read The Lawless Land. Why don't you guys talk about that one first?
Boyd always does the summaries of our novels, so I'm going to hand it back to him.
Oh, well. So in The Lawless Land, an excommunicated knight has lost his land and his reputation and his title, and he is trying to gain them back and get justice for the crime that's been done against him. And he's on the road in England and comes across a woman who is fleeing her brutal fiance. And they find out they have a common enemy, and so they go on the run together from very powerful figures who are after a priceless object in their possession. And what kind of object is that, Beth?
So I told Boyd that I wasn't going to do this project with him unless a medieval manuscript would be at the center of the plot of the first book. And so I had to figure out what kind of medieval manuscript, if it was found, could actually change the course of history in Europe. And so it was really fun. I got to design the cover and the illuminations inside and everything. It was super fun.
Yeah, and so we actually traveled to England, France, and Italy. The two of us and my wife always go together to do this research, and we plot out the books beforehand to some degree to know where we wanted to go visit. And then when we go to these places, we see a lot of things that just didn't occur to us, like the Mont Saint-Michel, the quicksand features into the story.
Yeah, and so one of the things that's really great is that when we do the tours for these books, both the first one and this one, we actually go in the same order that our characters are going to go. And a lot of these places we've picked because neither of us have been there. We want a research trip. And so we're really encountering these places for the first time ourselves and kind of seeing them through our characters' eyes. And so Boyd looks for the potentials for explosions and things to kill, and I look at the artworks and how to incorporate them into the book.
Mont Saint-Michel, have any of you been there? Yay. Well, it's perfect for what you wanted to do. If you haven't heard about it, it is not exactly a peninsula, but anyway, Mont Saint Michel is built on a giant rock out in the, what is it, the channel, isn't it? Because it's near Saint Malo. Generally, if you're traveling, they dock at Saint Malo and then you go to Mont Saint Michel. And there are very treacherous sands all around it. So forever it was protected by the sands. And if you didn't know the tides, people would very often get trapped and drown. Now today with tour buses, there's a causeway. Although, all the mistakes, you could still gratuitously go out there and drown yourself, but they don't expect tourists to figure out the tide flow. But anyway, it rises up. So, and there's a wonderful, because it's part of your book, describe the mechanism at the wonderful wheel on the hull deck, because it's really a very cool medieval device.
Yeah, there's you can see it when you're walking up to the island, that there's this very steep ramp and there's this gigantic cart connected to a rope that they could lower down to the base of the island. And because the monastery is perched far, far above, and walking up to it takes quite a long time, and just carrying supplies would have been very difficult. So they had this cart where they could pack things onto it. And then they had a hamster wheel, basically, that is human-sized. And so it's called a windlass. And people would walk in this hamster wheel, and it would wind the rope and whatever the rope was pulling up. And so that's how they would bring supplies up to the monastery and lower food down to the pilgrims and people who had come to visit. And so, of course, as soon as I saw that, I thought, okay, how can we turn this into an action
explosion
scene? Yeah.
It's ideal. Actually, it's still there and still in working condition. I mean, it's remarkable how well this medieval, when was it built? Do you know?
Well, that's in dispute, because we had two different stories, actually. The tour guide who took us around said it was built in the medieval times, but then we had read another story that said it was actually built when Mont Saint Michel was turned into a prison I think in the Napoleonic era. And so nobody knows for sure, which is great for us, because then we can just make it up.
But no, I didn't mean the windlass. I mean the monastery.
Oh, the monastery? I think it was
It's been
built
there since the 8th century.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
It's a very, very old. And one of the things that's interesting about when we do these travels is that one of my big jobs before we go on all these travels is to figure out what was there in 1351 and not in 1352 in every single place we visit. And a lot of the things we can't really tell but a lot of it is very well documented. In fact, especially in Italy, and we would be like, oh, that was built in, 1352, darn, we can't use it. But that's one of the things is in these travels is that we have to subtract out everything that wasn't there in our time period. And that's hard to do.
But it's still surprising how much was there and is still there 670 years later, which is why we like to feature places that you can still go visit to this day, and imagine that they would have seen almost the same thing in their time period.
Yeah, for some of the cities, it's more like Siena in Italy, which features in this book. It really does look exactly almost as how it would have looked in 1351, because Siena in Italy, has everybody been there? You should go. It's fabulous. But the city basically died with the Black Death in 1348. And so basically what you see there is exactly what they would have seen in the 14th century. So we try to pick cities where a lot of the existing architecture, and, we fantasize about someday when, we have tour groups going through trying to do the Beth and Boyd, Tales of the Lawless Land tour. So
you can see, even though I've said that's a swashbuckling adventure, there's really serious scholarship. Beth is not cutting any slack to the actual facts. And that, makes it fun to read them. And at the same time, that it's the real deal in terms of the events and what happens. So I had the privilege of reading the manuscript of The Lawless Land before it got turned into a book. And we had a brisk discussion about how it might end. I won. And when you read it, I think you'll be very glad that I did. And now we're moving on with the cast to the Last Templar. Now, that is a really terrible, I've always thought, a really terrible story. The King of France was both greedy and corrupt, and the Pope was weak. And take it from there, Beth.
So a lot of people ask me who are not familiar with the Middle Ages, they think the Templars are just made up, but they were a real order of knights in the Middle Ages. And as Barbara mentioned, they were in cahoots kind of with the French king. They became so wealthy, in fact, that the French king began to borrow money from the Templars because they were so wealthy themselves. And at the end, he couldn't pay them back. And so what do? You decide that they're all heretics and you burn them at the stake, and you don't have to pay back any of your debts. And so they did have a very bad ending, and that bad ending is the very beginning of our book.
It was at 1305, wasn't it, when they were all burned in the wherever it was in the square? Your book takes place later than that, but
Yeah.
that's when the Templar, the famous lost treasure of the Templar, kind of arises from the execution. They were burned at the stake. Anybody who'd read Hilary Mantel and, know what happened to people who got wealthier than Henry VIII, or if you know your history of France and you know that Vaux-le-Vicomte was an estate built and the financial minister of France made the mistake of inviting Louis XIV to visit, which was a real mistake. And that's where Versailles was inspired. Louis thought, well, if he can do Vaux-le-Vicomte, I can build a bigger, better palace. So it's never a good idea to be more powerful and richer than the king.
Yeah, and the Templars were really the first international bankers. They invented the medieval version of the ATM. They got their money because pilgrims who were on their way to the Holy Land kept getting robbed. And so they founded their order and to protect the pilgrims on the way to the Holy Land. And of course, the reason they were getting robbed was because they had to take so much money because it took so many months to get to the Holy Land. So they invented this new system whereby you were in Paris, you would give them your money, and they would give you a letter of credit, the first letters of credit. And then you would travel to the Holy Land, you would present that letter of credit, and then they would give you money. So it really was a medieval version of the ATM. If you happen to die along the way, maybe they got to keep your money, maybe they charge you a small amount of money for change fees and whatnot. And so that's how they became the wealthiest organization in Europe at that time period, which inspired
the banking system in Florence. So, of course, the most famous bankers in Florence were the de Medicis. They came along a little after the time period of our book, so we kind of just fast forwarded the banking industry development in our story, and so the main villain in our story is basically a precursor of the Medicis, and kind of shows how he would have built his empire in this story based on what he knew about the Templars. And that's really where they got the idea of changing money and investing and getting income from investments. And that's how how Florence became so rich for the Renaissance.
So why are our trusty knight and company, why are they actually there in Italy?
So they, I don't want to give away the end of the first book, but they are now traveling through central Italy, trying to decide how they are going to work as a couple, basically on the run, as knight errant. And they come across a woman who is under attack by a band of marauders in a small town in central Italy. And they, of course, come to her aid and help her escape. And they find out that her father, who was the last true Templar, left her a series of codes that would lead her to the fabled lost treasure of the Templars that they hid away so that the King of France wouldn't find the bulk of their money. And so she finds that I won't name who's after her, but to save her life, she has to find the treasure, and our main characters have to help her because they're in danger as well. And so they go on this quest across Italy trying to solve a series of puzzles that depend on the art and architecture of Siena and other cities in Italy, and we a lot of times use actual art and architecture, again, that would have been there at the time of our story, but you can still go and see to this day.
And it was actually really fun because the Last True Templar dies in like 1314, and our book doesn't take place till 1351. So he thought that his daughter was going to solve these clues right around the time he made them in 1314. So our characters are encountering art and architecture, which of course has changed since 1314. And Boyd and I kept getting messed up and being like, wait, was that there then? And we thought, oh my gosh, the characters are going to go through the same thing. So we made that a central point of the plot, is not only do they have to figure out the clues, but they have to solve the clues as if it was 40 years earlier. So it really became really fun. And just, Boyd actually writes the books. We work out the plots and I help him with all the medieval stuff, but he really does the writing because he's the expert. But I got to write the clues for this one. So I actually have some little bit of writing in this one, which is super fun for me.
So you all recognize that, a knight errant is a knight who's traveling around looking for dragons to slay, right? Well, no, it is. I mean, that's what he is, right? He's a knight. I mean, it's classic. It's Arthurian, that concept of, and, it's the Marvel comics. It's the same thing. It's Superman and, Spider-Man and Batman and all. We have never really lost our appreciation for stories where the hero is out there to, confound the villain and save us.
Well, and even Lee Child has talked about Jack Reacher being a modern knight errant.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of stories that are along that tradition. The Man with No Name from the Clint Eastwood westerns, The Mandalorian is really a knight errant in the future. So so we just decided we're going to go back to the origin of that legend and do a knight errant in the Middle Ages looking for dragons.
So I'm hoping that in book 3 or 4 there will be a dragon. Right. Well,
there might be.
All right.
And it was fun for us because, of course, this was a genre. The thriller genre was invented in the Middle Ages. So we're just going back and doing it from the source.
You are. Well, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Francine, where are you? You're next because we're moving to the Regency. So now, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is only book 2, and book 1 is up in the front, The Lawless Land. So this is your chance to acquire both, which would be wonderful. Hi.
Hey.
So Francine writes her historical novels as Stephanie Barron. But since I know her as Francine, I'm going to call her Francine. And if I've confused you, I'm sorry. But if I try to call her Stephanie, I'll just blow it. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. So we realized we've been together for 30 years. Wow. From Jane Austen.
Loosely together.
Yeah, okay.
I live in Denver. She lives here, but
Well, that's true. But literally, we have been on a journey together for a very long time through many wonderful books. And this is the 15th and final Jane Austen mystery, for reasons that Francine will now tell you about, in terms of what happened to Jane, because you have followed Jane's life through her letters all the way through.
yes. So I came up with the idea of this series 30 years ago, which is just terrifying. But I have written other books in between these. So there are 15 novels in this series, but the first came out in 1996. I wrote it in 1994. And it began with Jane at age 26. She died at 41 and a half, and that's 15 years, and there are 15 books. I chose 26 as the age to pick up her story because it was the year 1802 in which she both accepted and then rejected a young man named Harris Big Withered and his proposal of marriage. And Harris, she was 26, he was 20. He was just down from Oxford. He was the heir to the estate Manydown Park, which was owned by her very, very good friends, the Big Sisters. The Big, B-I-G-G sisters, Kitty, Elizabeth, and Althea. These women remained Jane's friends throughout her life. Harris, however, was socially awkward. He had a pronounced and severe stutter. He offered her survival, her family some measure of support if she married him. And the fact that he was related to some of her very dear friends was important. So she initially accepted the proposal. 26 in Austen's time was an advanced age to be unmarried. And she was unmarried not because she was unattractive, she was, but because she had no fortune. And England in 1802 was in the throes of constant warfare, just as it would be up to the point when she died. And so many of the men who might have been of marriageable age for her were either out on the sea, as her two brothers were, as post captains in the Royal Navy, or they were fighting land wars, either throughout Europe or in the U.S. eventually in her lifetime, the War of 1812. So her male prospects were dim. She accepts Harris. She goes to bed that night. She wakes up in the morning and rejects him, which is a huge social solecism. She and her sister Cassandra had to leave the home of the big sisters and go back to their house in Steventon, cutting short their visit. They got over the social solecism part, and she did remain friends with the women her whole life. So fast forward to 1817, Jane is very ill. I've followed her through every year of the intervening period. She moved a great deal because her father dies. The women are dependent on her brothers. They're very peripatetic. They're taking lodgings in various towns, Southampton, Bath. They finally end up in Chawton, which is a small town in Hampshire, living in a cottage that her one wealthy brother lets them inhabit on one of his estates. And Jane starts to get ill. She's now published 4 of her novels. She ends up going to Winchester, which is a town in southern Hampshire, the old royal and ecclesiastical center of southern England. It's a wonderful city. And she goes there in part because her very good friend Elizabeth Bigg, who's now the widow of a man named William Heathcote, is living in the Cathedral Close, which is the walled area of ancient homes. They've now mostly been converted to ecclesiastical buildings affiliated with the cathedral. But at the time, they were given to men who were canons of Winchester, which meant 2 things. That they were, back when the English Church was Catholic, they were clerics affiliated with the old abbey and the Cathedral of Winchester, but also they were important in the founding of Winchester College for Boys, which is the oldest public school for boys in England, founded in the 14th century. 8 of Jane Austen's nephews went to Winchester College. So she had a lot of ties to the town. But it's Elizabeth Bigg Heathcote who finds her a place to live and who puts her in the care of her personal doctor. And when Jane dies a few weeks later, and she's buried in Winchester Cathedral. A lot of people find that odd and are wondering why she wasn't buried in her own home. But in July in 1817, you didn't transport bodies. So that was part of it. Part of it was that she had so many connections to the clerical life of Winchester Cathedral. I loved the fact that she, I begin the series with her refusing Harris Bigg with her, and I end the series with her in the heart of the Heathcote family, because that felt like a really important closure arc for her story. Elizabeth Heathcote had 1 son, a boy named Will Heathcote. She'd been widowed when he was less than a year old. He was a student at Winchester in 1817, 1806, well, a couple of years before that as well. So he was a very close friend of Jane's nephew, Edward. And this book concerns Edward, Will Heathcote, Jane, and Elizabeth Heathcote. And the murder and the mystery is set in Winchester College for Boys. So it's very much a sort of academical story and a family one as well. And it's about boys coming of age and...
It's also, and I think you did a great job, it also is about the brutality of the English public school system and why it was, in fact, partially or perhaps always deliberately designed to toughen up young men so they could be out.
Creating
Andrew,
empire.
you're the only person here who's actually been to an English boys' public school. So, can you speak to that?
Oh,
Right. But
honor.
there was a certain amount of brutality in the way, maybe not when you were there, but when.
You're absolutely right. That was the purpose. The purpose was to, prepare people to go out around the world and conquer it and run it.
Well, one of the interesting things I discovered in reading about Winchester at the time, and I should point out there are numerous contemporaneous accounts of being a schoolboy at Winchester in roughly 1815, Anthony Trollope being the most famous person at that time, roughly, is that the class system was so terribly important to the running of the school. So the year after this novel takes place, there was a great rebellion at Winchester. Rebellions had been going on at the boys' public schools from the late 1700s on up. And they were rebellions that were triggered because the boys felt the masters had absolutely no social precedence over them to discipline them because they outranked them in terms of birth. And so the boys at Winchester barricaded themselves into the dean's rooms, the dean being not the head of the school, but actually affiliated with the cathedral as well as the school in a clerical sense. This dean was a double bishop of the British Church. They barricaded him into his room. They basically held him hostage along with the head of the school, Dr. Gable, to bring home the point that only the prefects should be allowed to discipline the boys. And the prefects were older boys who were appointed partly because of their birth. So it reinforced this incredible class system of who got to beat whom, essentially, and how discipline was conveyed throughout the ranks of the school. And in writing an account of this rebellion, Dr. Gable mentions William Heathcote as having been a boy who stood against the terrible brutality of his time, which suggests he was not sympathetic to the rebellion. So all of this sort of culture was fascinating to me as a background, and the fact that 8 of Jane's nephews, including Edward, who was the son of a clergyman, were schooled in this sort of world was something I absolutely had to use for the book.
One of the things that I find fascinating about the whole series that starts with Jane and the unpleasantness at Scarborough Manor is, sorry?
Scargrave Manor.
Scargrave. Why do I want to? Well, anyway,
Everybody
all right,
does.
I was close. Scargrave Manor.
Right.
Is that Francine has thoroughly acquainted herself with the letters between Jane and her sister Cassandra, who lost her fiance before they were married. So she too was a lifelong spinster. And so Francine has written the books in those sort of interstices in Jane's life that are not recorded, so she can make up stuff without actually crossing the historical
violating the record.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, and so she had not exactly a romance, but she had a really interesting relationship during part of the series with one of those unstated agents of the crown. Tasha, this will ring true for you, right? Where they're up to like the Queen's business, but nobody actually knows about them, and they have private incomes, so they don't have to be paid, and, on and on. And I thought that was, nice that you gave her a bit of a
Intrigue.
yeah. Well, and somebody that cared about her. I thought it was
Yes,
really
I've had
very
readers
good.
say that I should have her bear Napoleon's love child. But I did draw the line at that. So, yeah, the fun thing about playing with history is what you get to make up. On occasions when I have written novels centered entirely on a particular letter, for example, a book that you're going to read called Jane and the Man of the Cloth, which is the second in the series, she wrote an incredibly detailed letter from Lyme Regis, which is where Persuasion is set. Louisa Musgrave falling from the cob, in which she detailed every person they met, their jobs in the town, with whom her mother played whist, whether there was moonlight on a particular night, because you only really went out for social engagements if there was a strong moon in a carriage, so you didn't have difficulty on the road. She mentioned the doctor who saw her when she had a cold, so I knew which day of the week she had a cold. She mentioned going bathing in a bathing machine off Charmouth, so I knew the day she went swimming. I had a whole cast of characters handed to me, and I made one of them the murderer and one of them the victim. And they're all mentioned in the letter. So if she did write a letter from a place, I tried to scrupulously use it as a sort of template. But all the books are mosaics of fact and fiction, because of course they are. She wasn't a detective.
If you actually want to see what people wore and what the buildings look like, you can, bearing no relationship whatsoever to scholarship or fact, you could watch Bridgerton, or you could watch Sanditon, which I think is getting a second season or something. And I advise you to do that really just for the clothes, which are amazing.
But not the hair. The hair in Sanditon is all wrong.
And they actually, if I remember right, filmed Bridgerton in Ireland and Dublin because it has more Georgian or Regency era buildings than London, which of course during, was bombed in the war, the whole bit. But it gives you an idea, because fashion is such an important part of, it was that
world.
Yeah, and it was also a big time of transition between the formality of the 18th century and the fashion can tell you so much about what's going on.
I equated actually the Austen era to the 60s here in the sense, or the 1920s here, in the sense in which fashion changed. Yes, from restrictive, really, really restrictive clothing to very light, flimsy, body-defining clothes.
They used to actually, what they called damp their muslins, but they used to, in order to make the clothes more transparent, they used to water them down. So when they went in, unsurprisingly, a lot of people got pneumonia and died. No, it's really true. And then, we ended up in the Victorian era with, very...
Again, corseting.
Corsets and crinolines, and we went back to that and the whole bit.
Fashion as armor.
Yeah, but I've always been fascinated with the history of fashion as it relates to other things in the world. But it was wartime. Try to remember that the Regency, there was a 20-year war that was going on between Napoleon and everybody else, and nobody knew how it was going to come out until Waterloo in 1815 on a Sunday in June. And it could have gone either way.
Right, and one of the things that I love about Austen is that she's often criticized for having written novels that reflect nothing of the warfare in her time. And I always say that that is a fallacy of the reader, because she was writing for contemporaries. She didn't have to spell out a lot of things. So when she says something quite simple like Eliza Bennet is sitting down for want of a partner, the scarcity of men in the room, obliging her and other young ladies not to dance, it's because there is a scarcity of men in the room. There's a scarcity of men in England. They're all out fighting. And that was implicit in her work. Persuasion, her most obviously warfare-related novel, which centers around the British Navy. Again, if you are reading it today and you actually care about these things, you have to sit down and look up what was an admiral of the white, what was an admiral of the blue. And she understood all of this because she had two brothers who were post captains. She worried about them constantly. In one of her letters, there's this wonderful passage where she's writing to Cassandra because they happen to be apart, but they're in the same area of Kent where her elder brother lived, who was landed and wealthy. And she says, it's August, it's 1805. She says, the depredations of the militiamen upon the gentlemen's birds is much talked of, and the indignation seems likely to bring about a demonstration of some kind. This is in a letter. And you read it and you think she's just talking about something to do with shooting birds. Well, actually, what she was talking about was the fact that it was 1805. It was summer called the Great Terror, in which all of Kent was under watch because it was expected that Napoleon would invade. He had assembled a fleet of 300 ships in Boulogne, and he was planning to invade England that September. Jane's brother, with whom she was staying, was a justice of the peace of the county. He had all of the evacuation plans for the entire coast. There was a company called the Sea Fencibles, which were militiamen who were guarding Ramsgate, and they were going to actually have a troop movement down to Canterbury, which is where Jane was. And they were going to go through the fields, and they were going to disrupt the grouse shooting in August. And the local gentry were furious. Jane is telling Cassandra this because she is being snarky. She cannot believe that these guys are upset about the shooting when their two brothers are on the blockade in the channel that is protecting the Kentish coast. So there's all this implicit in her work, whether it's in her letters or her books, that displays her knowledge of contemporary events, but she took them for granted, and she took for granted that her readers did too. So now when people read them, they see Bridgerton, her novels, but there is so much underlying all of it in the dialogue and the descriptions that implies the reality of Britain in 1811 to 1817.
It's important to remember she didn't write historical fiction when she wrote it. No more did Agatha Christie. You know, we look at Agatha Christie now, we think it's historical fiction, but she was writing in real time in the 1930s. You know, it's sort of have to keep up with all that. So I think you've done an amazing job writing your way. Because this project, when you started it, I remember you didn't want to write to the end of Jane's life. You didn't actually want her to die on the page, and she doesn't.
She doesn't.
A spoiler, but
yeah, I pulled my punch.
I thought, you know, every time you'd get closer, I kept thinking, is this the last one? Mm-hmm. And then there would be one more. But this really is it, though.
This is the last one, yes. I ran out of Jane. But, you know, there is something poignant in inhabiting someone's mind. I feel like I've said this in written pieces, that I've been adrift on the sea of Jane's thought for the past 30 years because I've immersed myself so much in her language, her letters, and her books. To know, as I did, that she was coming to the end of her life when she did not know it as a character in my books was a very strange duality to inhabit as a writer. Because I was creating a landscape through which she was moving, aware of her destination when she was not. And that's been challenging because you have to balance that foreknowledge yourself with her innocence in the character as you're writing it. So that's been a fine-tuned process. It was easier, obviously, to write the earlier books. But that's something I've said to Barbara for years, that I fundamentally believe series have a certain lifespan. And if you violate its lifespan, you end up writing dead fiction. And I don't think any of us ever wants to do that. So it feels correct, you know, that the series is ending as it is.
I'd also point out real quickly that Jane Austen was a pioneer in a way of the literary form. The first novel in English, I think, was Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which was, 1747 or 49. And because nobody knew how to write a novel, he wrote it as a series of letters. It's called an epistolary novel because that solved the whole problem of whose voice you were hearing. It moved the plot forward as the letters moved forward. You know, it was an excellent device for telling. Sorry about that. I can't fix it, but it won't come down on you. And Jane wrote an early book called an earlier work called Lady Susan, which is in fact an epistolary novel. It's part of her juvenilia, right? The early works.
It's an early work, yeah. I wouldn't call it juvenilia.
Well,
but yeah.
I'm not sure she was ever a juvenilia. I think she was such an intelligent person. And if you ever go to Chawton, it's very moving to see this little table and chair kind of in a corner where she wrote. And every time anybody would come, she would gather up her work, right? And kind of...
Yeah, there was a creaking floorboard that she asked them not to ever fix because she could... The floorboard warned her of someone's approach, and she wrote on little chapbooks that she created out of paper that she sewed together, and they have those.
Right. So there was no privacy. She didn't have a study. And, I think about authors today who talk about writing in coffee shops, like William Kent Kruger, who's, written in coffee shops forever. There used to be a guy that used to write in, was it Hardee's? I can't, anyway, one of the fast food things. And there was Jane, in the middle of a busy family life and the whole bit, writing her novels. And it wasn't considered, it was difficult for a woman to do that.
That's the interesting thing. In refusing Harris Bigwither, people love that name. She was making a really radical choice, which was to turn her back on security. And she has several of her heroines do that, obviously. She has Eliza Bennett do it when Lizzie refuses Mr. Collins and Charlotte instead takes him up. And importantly, Lizzie is 20 when she makes that choice. Charlotte is 27 and is a much more cynical woman on the social scene who, of necessity, says, I have no choice. I have to do this. I will never have this opportunity again. So refusing that, Jane importantly, radically chose a different life. And had she married Harris Bigwither, we would never have known her name. Because she may have written them, but she would have performed them for family functions, which is how she started out in her writing. She would not have probably sought publication. And publication gave her a really important independence, and she cherished it. She would talk all the time in letters about how much she had made on certain books. Pride and Prejudice did well, really well for her, and went into a second edition. And she also created something unique, which was she became essentially her own publisher. In her era, you didn't just sell your manuscript to a publisher, you sold the copyright to your work. And so the publisher owned your copyright, you did not, which meant that you were essentially paid for the manuscript and some sales, but you were not going to receive royalties for the rest of your life. She did that for her first 2 published books, and then she, with Emma, basically decided to pay the publisher to publish her book, and kept the copyright. And that was an important difference. It was something that it was very risky in people's minds to do that, but it ensured that she made more money. She was very savvy as a business person. And she said, I've made such and such, which of course only makes me want more. But she lived on £50 a year, which was equivalent of maybe $50,000 now. You tend to round up by a factor of 100. And so I think, it's an interesting testament to her choices.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sure.
Right. Tasha. I have to get my hat. Wait. And we're going to talk about witches. Some people think I am naturally in that role. So here we go.
I don't see a broom anywhere.
What?
I don't see a broom anywhere.
I parked it in the back room. Right. So Tasha indeed has written a whole series of books with Lady Emily. And we first meet her. She is a widow. And we have progressed through her adventures, her remarriage, her becoming a mother. We have moved around much of certainly Europe. We've even been to Egypt. And now we're in Scotland.
We are indeed, which, always seemed a natural choice. You have to have a Scotland book. Every aristocrat has a friend with a castle in Scotland, right?
Right. Well, in this bookstore, Scotland really rings true. Right. We know a lot more about Scotland than many bookstores might happen to know because of Outlander. Right. But you like to tie your stories to an earlier narrative track, as well as the one that you're writing about with Lady Emily. So Scotland was an absolute hotbed of witch hunts, wasn't it?
It was, and I knew that, but I did not know until I started doing the research just how brutal they were. They were killing witches at a faster rate than any other place in Europe, which really shocked me. I expected more from the Scots. I was a bit disappointed in them.
They had an actual witch hunter. I mean, it was a real job.
They did. No, he was self-styled. I'm losing what do you call himself? I can't remember now. I'm blanking on it. What did he call it?
Was it witch finder?
It was witch finder, but didn't he? He was like the great witch. It wasn't great, but he was an absolute charlatan. He had no obviously he had no qualifications, but one of his big things was going around with a pin, like a blade, like a sharp stiletto kind of blade that he would poke the witches with, because, a witch wouldn't feel the pain, and wouldn't cry out. But it had a hollow handle so that he would poke you with it and it would just go in. So, I think if it were me, I would have just shrieked anyway, wouldn't you, as soon as you knew it was near you?
Probably.
But there's something almost Monty Python-esque about it. If she weighs more than a duck or... but it's absolutely horrific that how many thousands of people died because this guy said, yep, she's a witch. I've done the tests. She's a witch.
It was a largely 17th century. I mean, it did go longer, but in Scotland anyway, very much a 17th century thing. And the Scots took to Protestantism in a more radical way than many people did. They went into Calvinism and, things. Maybe it's the climate, the sort of bleak outlook. Yeah. But the witch finder, and it carried over here to, to Salem in this country. And, it's a terrible thing.
It is. And
there's no defense to being accused of being a witch.
No, because if you try to defend yourself, that proves you're a witch. If you don't try to defend yourself, well, obviously you're a witch. You can't win. I wondered while I was doing the research if part of the reason that it held in Scotland is that you do have such a rich culture of mythology and legend, and you've got all these mysterious creatures and things. So that you had, as people were getting more virulent about Protestantism, were they more worried about these people within the society who were still believing that Kelpies might be real, and if it was just nearer to the surface.
Well, yeah, and a lot of witches were really wise women who understood herbs and other things at a time when medicine was certainly not very advanced, and so and also there was, I think, there's all that thing about women and pregnancy, and we won't go into all that, but anyhow. But in this story, we are in 1905, when Emily and Colin and the three children, they're twins, and the boy they've adopted, go to Scotland to visit their friend Jeremy the Duke.
That's right. Because Jeremy, anyone who's read any of these books knows that, of course, Jeremy has a castle in Scotland because he looks really good in a kilt. So, That's how Jeremy operates. But we get there because at the end of the Egypt book, Henry, one of Emily's three sons, who is just trouble through and through. The other two are quite well behaved and respectable young gentlemen. But Henry is just always causing trouble, and he was quite angry at his parents for not taking him to Egypt. I think Emily had told him, or somebody had told him, that no one under the age of 10 was allowed in the tombs, so he accepted the decision initially, but then he found out that was not true, and was trying to get to Egypt, and of course can convince Jeremy, who is, although he claims to be the most useless man in England, was apparently useful if you're an 8-year-old, 7-year-old boy who's trying to get to Egypt. He can help you with that. But Henry learned that Jeremy, having a private menagerie, as lots of aristocrats did in the day, had a Nile crocodile in the menagerie, and thought that, well, if you're going to Egypt, you're going to bring your crocodile, right? That's just... it'd be uncivilized not to. So we meet Cedric the crocodile very briefly at the end of the Egyptian book. And the Scottish book has to be Scotland because that is this place where Jeremy's menagerie is. And Henry has concerns about the nature of the care that the animals are being given. So that's how we get to Scotland.
You don't normally expect a crocodile in Scotland, right? But it's a presence.
It is, and it, actually the whole inspiration behind the weird animals coming to Scotland actually comes from Andrew's mother. She had, was it a cousin or her uncle? It was her uncle was out at sea, you know, an Englishman out at sea, and whenever he would come back to Britain, he would bring exotic animals from wherever he had been at sea and give them to her mother, right? And so there were all these wonderful stories she would tell about being with her mother on the train with a box with, you know, a monkey in it or whatever, and they would go take it to the zoo in London and give it to them. Because what are you going to do if you don't have a castle? You know, if you have a castle, that's a different matter entirely because you have space for a menagerie. But yeah, so that's where I got the idea for animals, strange animals coming to Britain.
So if you have a castle and you're in Scotland, then shooting and hunting is going to be a part of the environment. And so you have a gamekeeper, right? And the body in this particular book is, in fact, the gamekeeper, right?
Right.
Which Emily, who has a penchant for finding dead bodies, anyway, they find the dead body. And so there's the mystery of who is the gamekeeper and why is he dead. But the backstory, I think, you know, there's a really brutal backstory in this. Wow.
Yeah. I when I was starting the research and I was trying to figure out what I want. Well, actually, I knew more about the second timeline than I knew about the first when I started, because it was that story that really drove the narrative and the ideas for me. I read several books and a couple academic articles about people of color in Tudor Britain. And there's a story about King James gets given as a gift, as you do, 2 young women from Africa. Well, you know. And I just that's so horrifying. And then we all know that slavery has been a thing throughout human history, but this idea that you've got these 2 young women, here, have a gift, have a couple people. But the thing that struck me as, I don't know, extra insidiously creepy about it is that they were brought into the royal household and dressed up and treated like courtiers, but they were kind of like pets. And you see people even now kind of saying, oh, but you know, they had really nice dresses and they're living in the castle and they're like hanging out with the prince. I mean, hey, you know, what's wrong with this? And this idea that it makes it less bad because no one's beating them, you know, it just made me really start thinking about this idea of what it means to be free and what it means to be a slave. And so I wanted to explore that further. And so I have a character, Tasnim, who everyone in Scotland calls Tansy because, you know, Tasnim is way too hard to try to figure out how to pronounce. But she is kidnapped she's Tunisian, she's from Tunis, and she is from an educated family. She's an educated young woman, but she is kidnapped on the street one day by a man who essentially uses her as a sex slave until he's bored, which, you know, doesn't take very long, and he sells her to someone else who then gives her as a wedding gift to his friend's new wife, who, being the enlightened woman that she is, frees her, which, sure, great, but what is this young woman with no means supposed to do? She's in the Scottish Highlands with no one she knows, and she has no way to get home.
It's true. She has no money and no independence. But actually, while I think her situation is terrible, I think the situation of the woman she was given to, a young woman who has married an older man who dies unexpectedly, suddenly she becomes a widow, and her husband's son throws her out. Not only does he throw her out, he throws her out with nothing. I mean, barely the clothes on her back. Normally, a widow got to live in something called a dower house or some kind of accommodation. He just threw her out into the cold and and the young Moorish woman goes with her.
Right.
And so, you've really written a survival story about them. And then one of them, inevitably, because we're in the 17th century, is accused of being a witch. So, I mean, it's a really terrible story.
Thank you. Thank you. It's hard.
Congratulations, Tasha.
Buy it here.
Heartwarming entertainment for the whole family.
Lady Emily's stories are generally lighter than that. But, so I think what it underlines is that women just had no rights at all. They had no property rights. They had no, you would expect that the widow of a relatively wealthy man would, have some sort of income, would have a home. And obviously she didn't have much in the way of a lawyer who could have drawn up a marriage settlement. Marriage settlements made provisions for widows, but she obviously didn't have one. Right.
That's
so when
right.
I say terrible, I don't mean that it's, I didn't mean it terrible in that sense. I meant, I just, it's hard to imagine being so powerless and having been thrown from a life where you would be completely unprepared for that.
And unprepared because society did not allow you to become prepared. You were in a society where it wasn't as if she could have said, well, I'm going to learn how to run the estate and I'm going to take on things of my own and I'm going to have an income. She had no power to even do that when she still was married before her husband died.
The one thing she wants to go back and reclaim for herself are her books. He didn't even let her take her books from the library. And we won't go into all that. But I did think that, I like the fact that it was books that she valued. She didn't want to go back for her jewelry or whatever else was in the castle. She just wanted to retrieve her own books.
Well, she does have a first folio, so.
Okay. Right.
Of course, a first folio then wasn't what we think of it now.
I say, I don't know that at the time that was recognized as some kind of economic advantage.
No.
Right. So back to, we can't talk anymore about that part of the story. Back to Lady Emily. What's happening there?
Well, I think one thing that was very fun in this book was having the boys on the page because usually, they were too young and they're now old enough that they can come and be part of the story. I mean, not all the time, not every book, but it was fun to have the dynamic, Colin and Emily with the three boys. Colin is a far more indulgent parent than Emily is. So I guess there's a way in which that piece of the story, you're seeing more family, you're seeing their family, and then you're also seeing some of Jeremy's family, his great aunts, who are holed up in the medieval wing of the castle, and they're playing Middle Ages, basically. Well, vaguely. They'd like to think they're playing Middle Ages, at least. And yeah, they were fun. You see another side of Jeremy. Jeremy is slightly less useless. In fact, Emily speculates that he may not be the most useless man in Scotland, and she's not sure how to handle that.
So Jeremy's role is, or wish anyway, is never to marry, and so the whole question of who will become the next duke is kind of off the table. But tell us a little bit about Colin, because I've mentioned earlier that he is one of those kind of unregistered, unacknowledged secret agents.
Absolutely, because you have all these, it's that during the Empire. You did have these gentlemen with a private income. You see the end of this era with James Bond, honestly, where, he is working for the government, but you have a gentleman of private means who is going to go around the world and quietly take care of things that need to be taken care of very discreetly. I set, when you're writing a book, you're setting things up deliberately. And I created Colin that way because I didn't want Emily to always just have to, oh, look, I've gone on vacation and someone else is dead. Sometimes it can be that they're going someplace because of Colin's work. And then you can get some tension between Emily and Colin because Colin can't even tell her what is going on with his work. So there's always a little tension with that between them as a result of his work. But he is that quintessential English gentleman who has a very keen sense of noblesse oblige, a very clear idea of right and wrong, but he doesn't always agree with what the British government thinks is right and wrong.
Right, and he's transitioned from being an agent of Queen Victoria to an agent of Edward VII, because Victoria died in 1901, and this series started, was it 1890?
Yeah.
Right, so you've moved
I don't
forward.
know how that ever happened. Like, I never thought Victoria would die.
No, and I don't
probably
think
didn't either.
anybody then did either. But, it's kind of like how surprised we all were when Elizabeth died, 'cause I was sure she was going to be a centenarian.
Okay, I'll tell you, I totally knew she was dying. Ask Andrew. I put a news alert for the BBC on my phone. I have no notifications on my phone turned on, but I said to him, I know the Queen is dying soon. And about 3 months before she died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Turned out she had multiple myeloma. Yeah, they finally released that as the cause of death. So if you looked at the last pictures of her, you could see the IV marks in her hands. So it was kind of, but I think she kind of lost the will to live when Philip died, but that's just me being a romantic. But, they'd been together since she'd been in love with him since she was, like 13 or something, 13 or 14. And I don't think she had a lot of wish to go on from that. So Francine mentioned about, and I thought beautifully about how you would write a book when you knew what was going to happen, and yet you didn't really want to bring it forward on the page. You're in 1905 with some young men, and we know that 1914 is going to come. Are you going to stop before you get there?
I don't want them to go to war.
Me either.
I mean, I'm not interested in that. And part of the reason I picked the period I picked is that I find what you said resonated with me so much. There's such poignancy to knowing that they are marching toward that war that is just going to devastate their entire society, and they have no clue. And we know. No. So, and the thing is, just given the way that I set it up in the first place, the age of the boys, they would be just the right age to be going off to the trenches. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, but you don't have, one of the great things about writing historical fiction is that nobody has to age in real time, right? Because they're already dead. So you can just kind of, move along to the next month in 1905.
You could have 37 books set in 1912.
Right. And, I was thinking, Boyd and Beth, you're in 1351. Your characters didn't have to acknowledge the Black Death, which wiped out, at least a third of Europe, right? Wasn't it? At least a third, I think, died in that plague year. There's a wonderful series written by a British author, name which is out of my head. But one of the things he talked about was that the universities were so decimated by death that they used to poach each other's students. The people from Cambridge would go to Oxford and try to steal some students and vice versa, just to keep the universities open, because there weren't, enough people involved. So Brother Michael, I can remember his Brother Michael from Cambridge was the series hero. I love those. Oh, Susanna Gregory. Yep. There's an example of old age when it comes back to you about 2 minutes later. But there were so many consequences of the Black Death. But, I thought you did well to move to 1351 Italy, where by then, it'd be like writing in 1918, knowing the flu epidemic was coming and what would happen.
Yeah, we're kind of the opposite. We have the consequences of the
Right. But you're not anticipating the Black Death, so there we are.
I love those wonderful little windows in Florence where they would serve the wine. So you would put your money, and then you would step away, and they would open the window and put a glass of wine so that you could have your wine. Because, look, it's a plague, but you got to have your wine, right? We have priorities.
Not any different than having food delivered during COVID, or stopping to get takeout at the door, whatever. Anyway, we can't say much more about spoiling the books. So we have a murder mystery in 1905 with a dead gamekeeper and what's all that, and then we have the fate of these two young women, because they are young, in 16 whatever it is, and what's going to happen to them. So when you're writing a 2-track story like that, do you write one and then the other, or do you go tick-tock back and forth while you're writing?
No, I tick-tock back and forth, and I generally have no idea how it's coming together. And especially with this one, I kept thinking, oh, I totally am. I feel like, to me, it's like, it reminds, so when I started writing, my son was 3.5. And when your kids are little, and you're they want you to tell them stories all the time, right? And you don't get to like say, okay, well, I'm going to just do an outline here. And we're going to think about the narrative arc. You just have to keep talking. And my son just loved me telling him stories. And he would say, Mommy, don't hit pause, play. And I don't know, it kind of trained me to develop, or just not even develop, but listen to my instinct. Like that you feel like, oh, we need something with this character to happen now, and now this needs to happen. And if I try to spell it out in advance, it is so tediously boring. No one would ever want to read one of these books if it would be horrible. But I can't know what happens on page 137 until I write page 136, more or less. I mean, obviously, I know who the characters are going to be, and I know what the setting is, and I know that in the end, it will all work out, like a Bollywood movie. But other than that, I don't know how.
Creative minds work differently, right? I know it's always an interesting discussion about whether people plot or whether they surprise themselves.
I'm jealous of people who can plot, because I'll sit there sometimes and just be like, dear Lord, how is this going to work out? There's an old New Yorker cartoon that it's scientists with a big chalkboard, and they've got all these, complicated formulas on it. It's like step 1, step 2, step 3 is a miracle occurs, and then you have the solution. And that's how I always feel like I'm waiting for step 3, the miracle to occur.
So one of the joys of reading this series, which I have truly loved and read in real time as Tasha has written it, is all the different places we get to go. So we've been in Egypt, we've been in France, we've been in Vienna, now we're in Scotland, we've been in England. Where am I missing? Oh, we've been in, Santorini, wasn't it?
Santorini and St. Petersburg.
In St. Petersburg, right.
Thank you.
Lots of exotic places. So I have to say that Tasha is an inveterate world traveler, so it makes it all kinds of fun, right?
It does. I mean, I so recognize the research trip. We were talking about this a little last night, where it's just a great thing to get to go to these amazing places and think about the history and figure out
Pompeii, right?
Pompeii. That was
right.
fun. That was very fun. Yeah. I just finished Bavaria. Next year's book is the Bavarian Alps.
How fun.
The secondary story is Mad King Ludwig.
I've actually been there, done all those castles. Are you going to debate whether he committed suicide or was drowned?
No, not exactly. I mean, it's barely
an
mentioned.
Ongoing, unsolved mystery. Did somebody drown him in the lake? He was about to bankrupt the Kingdom of Bavaria. He was also the guy that made Richard Wagner possible for a long time. So I'd been alive, I would have killed him right then. So I love his music, and I think the words are just horrifying. So there we are.
Yeah.
Right. I'll finish this up. I once actually went to Milan for a week with an opera touring company, specifically because I had never in a lifetime of loving opera seen the Ring Cycle. And I thought, if I go to La Scala and Daniel Barron is conducting, this has got to be me and the Ring Cycle. And I can't tell you how I hated it. Because the words were on, if I had just close my eyes and listen to the music, because the music is beautiful. And I think Wagner's music is amazing, but it really is better not to read the lyrics.
Have you read the letters between him and Ludwig?
Yes.
Yeah,
well, Ludwig was a closeted gay, and that was a big part of our problem.
That was a big part of, he's actually quite a tragic figure. Because
he built the Disneyland castle. If you go there, Hoch Weinstein and other, he was a builder, which is one reason he was bankrupting Bavaria. But the architect, he was like, he was exactly like the Regency. He was like George IV, was a great builder and a great art critic. Art collector rather, and maybe critic.
Not a lot of interest in running Bavaria,
though. No, George IV didn't have a lot of interest in governing England either, but there we are. Anyway, I think it's time that we take a break, because I know it's hard for you to sit in these chairs for too long. We have a lovely selection of shortbread and other things. Bathrooms right around the corner. Why don't we take 10 minutes, and then all the authors will be up here, and you can ask them questions, and I have books to give away. But wait, I forgot one thing before we do. Francine? I could not believe it when I opened up the New York Times book review this morning. No, wait. And I'm going to read you this little thing. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the earliest known person to mention a sponge cake in writing was Jane Austen. Jane is also, ready for this, our earliest source for these words: doorbell, sprawly, fragmented, and irrepressible. there's a new book out called The Dictionary People, and I have it here in the store now, but I brought this for you. Of course.
One of the things I love about Jane is that she uses words that if I used them as Jane, I would be excoriated for. Baseball. Jane Austen refers to baseball in Northanger Abbey. She uses the word depressed in Pride and Prejudice, which most people would argue was not in the lexicon until the late 19th century, but it was. And one of my favorites is electrifying. She uses the word electrifying way before anything was electrified. So she is a great source.
So anyway, give us a few minutes, then enjoy yourself, have something to eat. There's drinks over here in the cabinet, or there may be drinks back. No, there's iced tea back there. 10 minutes, and then if you have questions for the authors and want to participate in the giveaway, come back to your seat. Thank you. Oh, I've forgotten how heavy this is. It's a great hat, isn't it? I know, I love it. Well, I'm going to wear it for the questions too. There we go.